Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for coming to the online audience. My name is Tatiana Linkhoeva. I'm an associate professor of history here at NYU, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Gamboeva, our postdoctoral fellow at the Jordan Center. She graduated from the University of Virginia last year, and her dissertation was on Sakha literature from the late imperial to the Soviet period. And today she will talk about decolonial movements, I guess, in the post-Soviet period and the origins of those movements in late Tsarist and Soviet sciences. Right? So I'm looking forward to the talk. And we will have Q&A, and as usual, you either raise your hand, or if you are online, you can input your questions in the chat box. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the talk. People who came in person, thank you. And also my online audience on Zoom, thank you so much. So today, I wanted to talk about mostly, I titled it Soviet Physical Anthropology and Post-Soviet Decolonial Movements, but mostly I'm going to talk about the origins of post-Soviet decolonial movement, but like the history of ideas and what we see. So the reason why I wanted to bring up this topic was it has been a while, definitely since the word decoloniality entered massive public and academic milieu. I mean, massive, like everybody knows this word now, everybody heard of it now. And a while, meaning roughly 4 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we need to talk about, I feel like we need to talk about our results, accomplishments, or lack of them. And that's why I decided to bring up this topic. So I'm going to approach this topic not only as an academic, but also as an activist who participated in the post-Soviet decolonial movement, say largely, who participated in the conversations concerning decoloniality, decolonial thought in the post-Soviet space, all the different conversations with the members of the public that I had and members of academia that I had about this, problems that I saw from the start, probably, and problems that we can see today. I also will bring up the question of class, the influence of Western ideas on us, and also of course, the influence of Soviet ideological legacy too. So to define decoloniality in academia versus public, the definition of decoloniality, what means to decoloniality, what it means. This subject has been talked about it for a long time now, publicly, academically. So it doesn't talk so much that maybe for some people the word decoloniality has actually become ubiquitous, maybe meaningless often. But let's briefly summarize what's been said. So in academia, oftentimes in Russian studies specifically, and post-Soviet studies, this word is often associated with Lina Tlastanova. For her, decoloniality was more of a radical project that sought to dismantle the Eurocentric structures of knowledge and power from the perspective of those historically excluded from them. And she explicitly differentiated decoloniality from post-coloniality. Post-coloniality for her is a critique of colonialism and its aftermath, but from Western academic institutions. And decoloniality, on the other hand, is grounded in border thinking and body politics of knowledge, place thought, indigenous knowledge of the colonized and excluded people. Post-coloniality is grounded in post-structuralist and Western critical theory, while decoloniality again follows indigenous knowledge and indigenous body politics. Also important to mention Alexander Etkind is also frequently brought up. He used a framework related to post-colonialism to describe Russia's relationship with its own people and land in the form of internal colonization. He was criticized largely, but he still need to mention him. David Shoney Moore needs to be also his influential essay is the post-colonial the same as post in the post-Soviet, was frequently revisited, and he recently published an update to his 2001 essay too. He had an argument that post-Soviet space could be read through a post-colonial lens, and people often conclude that decolonial framework was necessary to account for the region's difference from the global south. Dr. Diana Kudaibergenova explored how post-colonial and implicitly decolonial rhetoric were used by elites in Central Asia to build national identity, sometimes reinforcing new forms of power rather than dismantling coloniality. There was also anthropological terms. Scholars like Sergei Ushakin explored the effective and material legacies of Soviet collapse, providing ethnographic depth to regions in Central Asia and Siberia, and focused on coloniality of being and how it was experienced on ground. So that was mostly before 2022, but the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 fundamentally altered the terms of the debate. It forced scholars to confront the reality of Russia's ambitions in real time, leading to a more urgent, politically charged, and self-critical set of arguments. So after 2022, the massive public also entered this conversation massively. And the decolonial studies became top. We started talking about decolonizing area studies and how we talk about Russia and the former Soviet Union at all. The war prompted a profound internal critique of the field of Slavic immigration studies, our field. The war made Plastanova's concept of imperial difference very concrete, and the scholars from Georgia and Ukraine argued that the war exposed the double coloniality, the historical subjugation under the Russian Empire, and the contemporary attempt to raise Ukrainian sovereignty and identities through a new violent imperialism. The question of intellectual and political responsibility became central to the public and academia as well. There were so many debates about how to conceptualize the decolonial potential within Russia. There were questions like, were Russian liberal anti-war activists decolonial allies, or were they still operating from a regular Russian imperial perspective? This question was frequently brought up on public intellectual platforms like Sigma, like Doxa, like even Jacobin, Vida Media, and a lot of academic listservs. New voices and centered perspective became visible after 2022. Was a surge of inattention to scholars from Ukraine and other post-Soviet nations, and their work was previously marginalized in Anglophone academia, but after 2022, Western academia became more open to diversifying the voices. Of course, after 2022, there were certainly debates around whether the term decoloniality is applicable to post-Soviet space at all before 2022, but after 2022, the criticism of the colonial movement and decolonial studies have become especially big. Scholars like Vladimir Ishchenko and Marta Havryshko discussed the influence of decolonial theory, Western decolonial thought on Ukrainian studies and Soviet studies in general. Vladimir Ishchenko in particular argued that contemporary decolonial movement in the post-Soviet space is mostly symbolic, and that it doesn't even have set a goal of accomplishing anything economic or political, just remove the symbols and replace them with something else. So in essence, in pre-2022 period, scholarship focused on adapting decolonial theory to the region's complex history. But after 2022, the scholarship and the massive public has been defined by a radical politicization of this concept. And it became used to confront an active war, to critique the academic field's own practices or media, and to amplify voices from the communities that face warfare firsthand. Okay, so one of the I think most important accomplishments of the decolonial movement in the post-Soviet space is the fact that I feel like it bridged the gap. It really did bridge the gap between academia and public. But again, we should, of course, remark what kind of public it bridged the gap with, because, of course, the people who are still in Russia, they, for example, they most of the time they're not able to participate in this conversation because this topic is very politicized and you can get in trouble in Russia for discussing it. So decolonization really entered the public minds. In the beginning, there was a surge of grassroots activities, grassroots mobilization. People started talking more about racism in specifically post-Soviet context. Things like events such as massive mobilization in September 2022 mobilized a lot of people to discuss specific concerns such as the economic struggles that people from Russian republics, specifically minorities, not from national republics, face in the face of the war. Maria Vyshkova is very important. Is a very important scholar who published a whole article about how indigenous peoples from national republics are overwhelmingly being mobilized, drafted to go to the war. Originally, so in early 2022, 2023, the grassroots decolonial movements had to do with everyday problems, personal group experience, gave rise to public intellectual media, like Bida media specifically, and the political imagination of decolonizing Russia, while it was discussed early on, it really most in my, at least in my perception, the public was mostly concerned with how the war affects groups and persons. So specifically discussions of race and racism after 2022, let me specifically talk about that. So race and racism really entered massive public attention in 2022. At least I can find two examples. The first example is when we started largely massively talking about race, is when there were instances when African students were not let into trains and buses that were leaving Ukrainian cities, the evacuation trains. There was another very important part is the whole drama around, sorry, not drama, the whole media storm around Buryat people in Russian army, foreign mercenaries in both Ukraine and Russia. Then the differences between Ukrainians and Russians were often racialized, even though they were presented as political, often very racialized. Yeah, so in all of these different problems, ethnogenetics in their very primordial variant came up in public conversation very often. People began discussing who is indigenous to this territory and who's not. There were people were talking about whether, so specifically I wrote a blog a couple of years ago for the Jordan Center discussing how Buryat people or Buryat nationality were framed in Ukrainian media since 2015, and how the face of how Ukrainian media since 2015 at least has been fascinated with the idea that Buryat people, or participate in the warfare against Ukraine, how Russian soldiers can have Asian faces. And Russian liberals after 2022 also jumped on that topic, largely trying to argue that allegedly Buryat people or Chechen people participate in the war because allegedly they are so warlike, and that they allegedly, because they are not Slavic, Putin uses them to kill Slavs because they're not Slavic. It's easier for them to kill Slavs. So I give specific examples of this in my blog post for the Jordan Center. So yeah, primordialism and ethnic essentialism, such as this one that I talked about right now, in public consciousness, what was very rampant became especially evident for me. Oftentimes when I try to explain, again, I have to reiterate, I have a pretty large social media following where I discuss such subject as decoloniality, race, nationalism, stuff like that. And oftentimes when I bring up these topics and criticize people's approach to race, specifically primordial, let me share this. Specifically primordialism, this is what primordialism is. Oftentimes, when I reiterate that there is a difference between how anthropology approaches ethnicity. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
So I try to reiterate all the time that there are different ways in which anthropology defines theories of ethnicity. So there are three main theories of ethnicity, and those of you who are anthropologists definitely know them. Primordialism, which is a theory that views ethnicity as something innate, essential, and ancient trait based on shared history, language, or blood. Very fixed, ancient, and always been there. Constructivism is a theory that sees ethnicity as a product of social, cultural, and political interaction, a collective identity that is built and maintained through social processes. So when we say race is socially constructed, gender is socially constructed, things like that, that's constructivism. And instrumentalism, it views ethnicity as a tool used by individuals or elites to compete for resources, power, status, and therefore ethnicity, according to this theory, is artificial and often used in a utilitarian way. I mean, Orthodox Marxists probably would align with that. Okay, so when I try to reiterate these things online or in public, just talking to different people, I often get the question from people specifically from Russian-speaking communities. They will ask, are you trying to say that race doesn't exist? That's not what I'm saying. Or another question, but the differences between what Sakha people or Jewish people or Russian people look like are obvious. People would say, sorry, I can't see the time. Yeah, so for example, you would say, we shouldn't treat, I don't know, we shouldn't treat nationality or race as something biological. But that's what I see. Because I consider myself mostly constructivist, sometimes maybe an instrumentalist. So here I'm arguing against primordialism. So when you as a constructivist try to say, oh, please, let us not treat race or ethnicity as something biological, innate, and something completely ancient and fixed. Let us remember that there's been so many different theories about how nationalities came to be, how ethnicities came to be. Race as a concept, as we know, is a product of colonialism. It's race.
Sorry, Anna, sorry to interrupt. The computer is about to restart, so I just need to do a little bit of troubleshooting really quickly.
Oh, should it stop talking?
Okay. No. Okay.
Oh no.
So here's what we're gonna do. Unfortunately,
This will take like 40 minutes.
yeah, so unfortunately, the people in the room won't be able to see your slide until this finishes. But everybody on Zoom is still in the meeting and can see your slides.
Can I just turn on mine?
So turn on your camera here. I'm sorry, everybody, about that.
Can they hear her?
They can hear her. Yeah, they can. Yeah, so you can turn your microphone on. I'm turning this off for now. So there you go.
Okay. Oh.
All right. You
Right.
try speaking again?
Yeah.
Perfect. So now you can turn
Can
your
you hear
camera
me?
on. Yeah. Yeah, they can hear you. That's this.
Oh, I turn my own camera on.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't see myself.
There
Oh,
we
there.
go.
Oh, the computer's
Okay.
back up.
That's you. So,
Sorry, everyone.
yeah, sorry about that.
Our computer just restarted. Oh, you can see it
Yeah, so
restarting back.
it shouldn't take 40 minutes. It'll probably take like 15 or 20. And once that is up and going, we'll pull it back up. But for now, people should be able to hear you on Zoom. And if you want to share your slides with everybody on Zoom, they'll be able to
Yeah,
see it
I
there.
will again. Sorry about that, everybody.
Okay. I'm so sorry about that.
Good. It's going good.
Everything's great.
Okay, so I'll share the slides again. Okay, so where did I stop? So in response to me trying to explain that race is not a biological, physical thing, people say, but the differences between an Asian person and a European person are obvious, and therefore they must be genetic. And then and I just I closed the case. So this is what I'm gonna talk about. So recently I had again this conversation with an archaeologist. And this person told me. So I was discussing recently on social media that there's a theory that exists in Central Asian countries and in Yakutia as well, that allegedly the people that the ancestors of, for example, Saha people or the ancestors of Kazakh people were blonde and blue-eyed. And this is a very popular public myth that I grew up with, and then later when I started talking more about to Central Asian people, they also told me that yeah, they've been told that frequently by teachers or parents or something. And then I tried to figure out where this comes from. I asked people around, and then an archaeologist responded to me, and I said that this is nonsense. That to even say that Saha people were blonde and blue-eyed in the past, look, who cares, you know? So then the archaeologist said, no, this is not nonsense. This is according to anthropological data, this is the quote, right? All the peoples who once lived in the forest zone of South Siberia were of the so-called mixed Euro-Asian type, although in fact it can be considered a variety of the Europoid type. Look at the book by somebody. The book was recommended, and also the genetic studies of the Pazyryk culture. I don't remember the name, but she only has one monograph. I think in genetics there is a concept of Siberian admixture in relation to modern peoples. The Mongoloid blood is very dominant, so it began to predominate. Sorry for using that word, but that's the word was used. And then continued the quote. It was characteristic of the inhabitants of the eastern steppe and mountainous Mongolia in the archaeological era and further up to Chinese people to have Europoid features. So this is the quote, end quote, that I received from an anthropologist. Again, so as you heard from this quote, a lot of primordialist language was used. The Asian type, the Mongoloid word, the Europeoid word, and this idea that somehow people can be put into these boxes and understood as types, and that their blood and ancestry is somehow completely ancient and unchanged. So this primordialism and ethnic essentialism is also has been actually talked about in academia a lot. Specifically Marina Mogilner, Viktor Schneiderman, Nikolai Zakharov talked about why primordialism is so important to Russian and Soviet anthropology. Mogilner specifically in the book Homo Imperii and many of her other works demonstrated that in post-Soviet anthropology, race or type was considered not as a social construct, but a biological reality similar to species in zoology. Mogilner revealed how this scientific taxonomy served in imperial governance by classifying people into types. Science also, the science provided authorities with a tool for categorizing and controlling them. She demonstrated that Soviet anthropology did not break with imperial racial science, but rather reworked it. Pre-revolutionary racial schemes were repackaged in Marxist rhetoric, but the essence, a biologizing approach to ethnicity, remained. Anthropological type became a euphemism for race.
Okay, the computer is working again, so let me get you back in. So you can turn your camera off and you can turn your microphone off. Thank you, everybody, for your
Article, Presidents and Archaeology, or What Politicians Are Looking For in the Ancient History. He looked at how politicians are looking for legitimacy in archaeology. He argued that in ethno-federal states, such as the former USSR, the power of titular nations rests on the idea of an indigenous population. To prove one's indigenous to the specific territory, one must have deep historical roots. This is why politicians are so fond of archaeology. It provides a scientific justification for their rights to territory and power. So Schneiderman provides a clear explanation why politicians are interested not in the Middle Age, specifically in antiquity, in ancient ages. He says little is known about ancient ages, and this data allows for imagination and the creation of attractive images. Ancient times are impersonal. We can speak of the leaders and their flaw as heroes. It's also pre-colonial ancient times. You can talk about ancient times as golden age of freedom and independence. And also ancient times confer prestige. The longer the history, the higher the status of the people. In Central Asia, he made actual specific examples from various parts of former Soviet Union that facilitate use archaeological data about ancient times to make very interesting interpretations, such as that Saha people have Aryan roots, or certain Central Asian people have Aryan roots. So that's probably one of the ways to interpret where the blonde and blue-eyed myth came from. And that's all present in Schneiderman's article. He says that In this quote, ethnic nationalism is captivated by the idea of indigeneity, in Russian autochthony, which justifies the high status of indigenous peoples and firmly links them to the territory of their current habitat. Ethnic nationalism is preoccupied with the problem of national unity and the protection of its territorial integrity. It tirelessly searches for moral role models, portraying ancestors as victorious conquerors, cultural bearers, creators of cultural values and statehood, and even portraying them as the ancestors of all humanity. All of this serves as a legitimization of contemporary politics and political mobilization. At the same time, in its extreme form, primordialism leads to the biologization of ethnicity and merges nation with race. Ultimately, blood is linked to soil. David Brandenberger and Terry Martin, as we remember, also had chapters in their books about primordialism and how primordialism in Stalinist nation building was very much linked to the process of nation building. So in many ways, it is not surprising that things like race, blood, and soil come up with when we engage in public conversation about decoloniality. So yeah, I wanted to talk, take the last 15 minutes that I have to talk about primordialism and ethnic nationalism in national movements. I argue that Western liberal theories very much feed post-Soviet primordialism and ethnic nationalism. Identity politics, Western identity politics based on constructivism. When they appear on the soil based on primordialism, this becomes an explosive thing. And I'm going to give you an example. So Timothy Snyder is very interesting. He's could be a nice case study to show how Western liberal intellectuals, despite their best intention and sophisticated frameworks, can sometimes inadvertently provide intellectual cover for the very ethno-nationalist essentialism they would likely oppose in America, say. Timothy Snyder is probably the most influential Western historian of Eastern Europe right now, for general audience at least. His work after 2014, and especially after the full-scale invasion in 2022, has become a key reference point for understanding the war for the larger public. Snyder's argument is rooted in a profound critique of Russian imperialism and a deep empathy for Ukraine's sovereignty. However, the rhetorical structure he employs often rests on a civilizational binary: authoritarian, despotic Russia versus enlightened, democratic Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and their resistance against each other. In his earlier work from Reconstruction of Nations from 2003, this civilizational binary is already there. It's implied in how he traces modern national identities of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, and Belarus, how they formed through complex interaction with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And there is an implicit contrast that somehow their histories were completely different and disengaged from Muscovy. However, at the same time, this reconstruction of nations is a very interesting and good work. After 2014, Snyder's work amplifies the binary much more explicitly. His most famous work, Bloodlands from 2010, created a powerful mental map for his readers within the binary. Central and Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, is a place of unimaginable suffering, repeatedly inflicted by two totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this, according to Snyder, creates a powerful moral network: the victims and the perpetrators. In his 2018 book, The Road to Unfreedom, in discussing the different historical paths, Snyder describes how the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 16th to 18th century fostered a republican parliamentary tradition, while Muscovy developed a patrimonial autocratic system where the ruler owned the land and the people. This is a valid historical argument. However, in this book, he uses this history, this old history, to support a very contemporary ideology that turns a valid historical observation into a civilizational binary. As Czech historian Pavel Barsa argues in his review of Snyder's book, Snyder's insistence on other popular liberal binaries such as collectivism versus individualism, authoritarianism versus democracy, is a crippling tool for understanding the present. Snyder's framework, according to Barsa, reduces the complex ideological struggles of the 20th and 21st centuries to a simple binary, liberal democracy versus totalitarianism. By viewing Putin's Russia and the rise of global neo-nationalism as a near resurgence of the same totalitarian threat the West faced in the last century, Snyder misdiagnoses the present crisis and proposes an inadequate cure. Barsa continues to argue that Snyder ignores the endogenous structural causes of the crisis, primarily the socially destructive effects of neoliberal globalization. The cumulative effect is to paint a picture of two fundamentally different political civilizations, one European and one not. Timothy Snyder is perhaps the single most important example of how a well-intentioned, let's say, liberal and anti-imperial intellectual can, through his powerful framing and immense public influence, inadvertently reinforce the very essentialist and civilizational binaries that they probably would oppose in the West. He provides the multicultural language that, when planted in primordialist soil of the post-Soviet space, yields an explosive and often xenophobic fruit. It is an illustration of the tragic mechanism of liberal multiculturalism turning into extreme ethnocentrism in primordialist soil. So phrase preserve our cultural identity and language becomes a conversation about genetics and biological essentialism, around who counts as belonging to this territory and who doesn't, and then the discussion of parliamentary Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth versus patrimonial autocratic Muscovy turns into a biologically essentialized conversation of whether Russia is Asiatic or European. What I see in here is a catastrophic synergy between two things. The post-Soviet political project of constructing nations as ancient, primordial, territorially fixed entities, and a Western liberal intellectual framework that maps perfectly onto these pre-constructed boxes and fills them with civilizational binary, democracy versus autocracy, Europe versus Asia, individualism versus collectivism. So to come back to Schliemann, how this mechanism works. So step one, as Victor Schliemann shows us, Soviet politicians build the boxes with primordialist archaeology, such as they use archaeology to create a powerful narrative, such as our nation has existed on this exact territory since the time immemorial. Our ancestors are great, pure, and culturally distinct. This territory is ours by primordial right. And this creates rigid, essentialized containers for nations. The logic of these containers is fundamentally territorial and very essentialist. Inside each box is a people with a fixed essence, biologized, geneticized, even craniology, even measured. A different conversation. And especially tied eternally to a fixed space of land. Step two, liberal binary provides the paint for these boxes, and thinkers like Snyder, with the best of intentions, perhaps, they call out authoritarianism by deploying a powerful civilizational binary. Ukraine and Europe is democracy, rule of law, Renaissance, Reformation, individual freedom, and Russia, Asia is despotism, the horde, tyranny, collectivism, and pathological political culture. Note again the topic of my Jordan Center blog about the framing of Buryat people in Russian army. In Barsa's terms, an anti-totalitarian framework that liberal thinkers engage with reduces complex historical and political dynamics to a moral duel between good and evil, Europe and Asia. And of course, with the presence of primordial anthropology in the post-Soviet space, that quickly turns into racism. Step three, the explosion. This is crucial. When Snyder's binary is imported into a region where the rigid primordialist boxes are the only reality, it doesn't land as a complex critique of political systems, as perhaps Timothy Snyder wants it to be. It lands instead as confirmation of primordial essence. So we are essentially European. Our box is the European box. Our essence is freedom. This is not a political identity based on choice. This is a biological cultural destiny. Then happens racialization of the other, and they are essentially Asiatic. Their box is a horde box. Their essence is slavery and cruelty. The critique of Putin's regime thus becomes a critique of the Russian people, their blood, their eternal character. What happens is a liberal, perhaps even constructivist argument about political systems is what happens basically. A liberal, perhaps even constructivist argument about political systems becomes decoded by a society saturated with primordialist assumptions as statement about biological and civilizational essence. The anti-totalitarian framework intended to defend liberal values becomes fuel for the very ethno-nationalist fires that Schneiderman describes and that Timothy Snyder opposes in America. Do I have time?
Yeah, 2-3 minutes.
2-3 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So Pyle Barsa's critique of Snyder is that he's fighting the war of the end of history. But Snyder, according to Barsa, sees Putin as a new Hitler or Stalin, and he reaches for the weapons of the Cold War distance. For Pyle Barsa, Snyder's book, the 2018 book, was essentially outdated. However, right now, as the decolonial turn to nationalism show us, Snyder's weapons are not just outdated. They are explosive. They're not outdated at all. They're explosive. When they land on the primordialist post-Soviet terrain, Schneiderman and Magivny describe. The anti-totalitarian framework with its stark moral binaries becomes a tool for re-primordializing nations in the very region that is already obsessed with primordial roots. What happens as a result? A Russian nationalist reads Snyder or other people who are influential and feels confirmed in their victimhood. The West has always seen us as subhuman Asiatics. Look at Timothy Snyder, that's how he shows us. A Ukrainian, Siberian, Kazakh, Polish nationalist reads Snyder and feels scientifically and morally validated in seeing Russia as something racialized. For Europeans, it's Russia as the Asiatic horde. Thus, the possibility of solidarity, class solidarity, of a shared critique of neoliberalism, of a political identity based on choice rather than blood, all of this is obliterated. So this is, I don't present it as a critique of Snyder. It is mostly a critique of how liberal internationalist multiculturalist discourse functions, oftentimes when its identity essentialism encounters post-Soviet primordialism. And it is a warning that good intentions, when filtered through other epistemic structures, post-Soviet epistemic structures, can produce monstrous political effects. This is the core of my argument, and it's both original and devastating. And I had more, but we don't have time.
Thank you. We have until 5:30 session or 5:30.
5:30.
Yeah, 5:30. So we have some 45 minutes for questions and answers, and I'm sure there is a lot to unpack. Many questions. I hope they will be asked. And if you're online, please raise your hand or leave your question in the chat box and questions. Yeah, Rosa.
First, really fantastic talk.
Thank you.
This was really extremely educational. And having grown up in a country, Bulgaria, which in the 90s our whole liberal elite was claiming our whiteness, our Europeanness. I very much also understand the dynamics you're describing, even if. But so I have two questions. One of which has to do with Soviet anthropology, and whether it was. The question comes out of my ignorance. Was it always that undifferentiatedly primordialist, or were there debates in different periods or different currents within Soviet anthropology? Maybe initially in the 20s. I mean, it's very hard to square this primordialism with, more principled Marxism. So, could you, speak in greater length about it? And my second question has to do with this most provocative propositions that you made about the interaction of constructivist Western identity politics and Soviet primordialism. And as somebody who's really an activist and indigenous activist in the post-Soviet space, I wonder whether you could maybe at a more granular level illustrate the reception, whether among the Timothy Snyders or other such Western theorists in a post-Soviet decolonial milieu.
Okay, thank you so much. Should I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Rosen. So to answer the first question, was Soviet primordialism always primordial? Was Soviet physical anthropology always a primordialist? I am not an anthropologist. I am somebody who is very much interested in anthropology, and I may not. I try to study my historiography. So basically, from what I read so far, it sounds like this whole question itself is quite controversial, because when we read the works of Nikolai Marr, for example, there are some scholars that I've read recently. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Schneedemann himself mentioned how Nikolai Marr's theories originally, they addressed the problem of biologizing essences. And specifically, as far as I remember, Craig Brandist has a whole interesting article on Soviet Indology and Nikolai Marr's original idea to criticize, to struggle against Indo-European Indology that was rooted in Brahmanism, that was rooted in British colonialism. And Nikolai Marr was one of the first thinkers that kind of decolonially tried to approach that and argue that no, actually the modern Indo-European, at that time contemporary Indo-European ethnology, was rooted in colonial and racist myths. And in other ways, Nikolai Marr was probably, he did contribute. Although, we know he's controversial, we know his other theories, but Nikolai Marr was one of the people who could, sort of begun a constructive criticism of primordial, although it wasn't his specific goal, though. Mikhail Pokrovsky's school, there are some thinkers that try to argue again, at least try to come up with something that wasn't biologist. But then again, when we talk about Soviet primordialism, Stalinist primordialism specifically, I mean, in Brandenberger and Martin and many others often posit that it was like a specifically Stalinist idea. But then again, if we look at the history of Soviet nation building in the 20s and 30s, it is very, I think it's very important for us to remember that constructivism as an idea began appearing after World War II. So I think it's important for us to remember that primordialism was a pretty universal European way of thinking about identities and races. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it was quite ubiquitous. All right, and to answer the second question, to illustrate reception of Snyder among indigenous peoples. So I tried to say specifically that I am not criticizing Snyder himself, right? For me, he's a more obvious, and not obvious, he's a more vivid example of this kind of liberal historical ideas that turn into biological essentialism in our post-Soviet soil. I would say that the reception of the ideas like that could be seen in, for example, when we talk about Russians in Siberia as colonists, oftentimes, we as indigenous peoples of Siberia, when we, as a massive public, as a product of primordialists, academic milieu, intellectual field, we see Russians as some sort of like a box, as an object that influences us or our nation as other objects. And in many cases, that oftentimes in conversations with the public, you can see people completely brush over the fact that, there were groups of Russian people, like Slavic Russian people in Siberia, who actually got it really bad under imperial times and Soviet times. And to this day, they struggle to revive their communities. I'm specifically talking about Sumeysky and old believer communities in Buryatia that were for a long time the Slavic Russian people in Siberia. There was a specific Facebook conversation. Sorry for bringing up here. There was a specific Facebook conversation that I had with somebody over a video, over an interview they had with a historian who basically in that video, they were trying to blame old believers for all of the injustices that Buryat people faced during the revolution. In the video, the interviewee and the interviewer was trying to paint like old believers as some kind of like white Europeans in North America. And in this Facebook conversation, I was trying to say that this is not quite an accurate view. And while, yes, many old believers did participate in, injustices that occurred in the Civil War, so were other Buryat people, and, it's not a productive view. And to use that framework, to use that history, the Civil War history, to argue that means that we should hate all old believers, that we should, not talk about old believers in the decolonial conversations. That whole thing is unproductive, because what do we even want to accomplish with this? That all old believers now, do we like? Send them away from Buryatia, from decolonized Buryatia? What do you want? It's potential. It's very dangerous stuff. Because like we laugh about it right now, but when we, let's say, decolonize Russia, I mean, that thing can become real. And then another thing was that all believer communities are also were drafted into the war because they also are extremely marginalized and extremely poor. Yeah, so yeah, when you are within these like conversations with mostly Western diaspora, Western educated diaspora, with people who emigrated from Russia and can freely talk about it, middle class people mostly, they often brush it off. They say, oh, they're old believers, they're Russians, so we don't care about them. No, like you're I don't know, your dad was like a
Yeah,
May-
I think we
Mary
can move to
Ellen.
another question, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right, one question from the audience, and then, sorry, let's ask Yulia Chernisova.
All good.
Yulia Chernisova.
Yulia, you should be able to unmute now.
Hi, can you hear me now, possibly?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. My name is Yulia Chernyshova. I don't know why it spells like that. I'm a PhD student in Slavic studies at Yale, and I was wondering, thank you so much, first of all, for tackling such a complex and abundant topic that provides us so many points for thinking. I was thinking about this talk in connection to one recent other talk, very stimulating, absolutely amazing, that was just held at Harvard by Greta Uhling, who is an anthropologist who just published ethnographic study titled Decolonizing Ukraine, and it's about the condition of Crimean Tatars of Ukraine and what is happening dynamically through the state discourse working through them. And one very striking point that came across in the discussion that I kept thinking about was how she framed her, how sometimes upsetting and like disturbing for her the conversations about let's tackle Ukrainian ethno-nationalism become, because in her words, there is something going on when this starts to be used as a like diagnostic criteria for future like politicizing and moral judgment upon Ukraine in a very static way when people start to focus on apparent and very obvious issues that still exist and do not create the space for looking at the dynamic, as in the Crimean Tatar case study. We can clearly see that the Ukrainian like state and nation major effort to really address the issue of indigenous people of Crimea and how this dynamically was like over time becoming more and more of a really common thing. It's not just something that state now pushes on or like European law integration pushes on. It really does become like the public request to know more about the indigenous people of Crimea, and the books start being published that incorporate like Crimean Tatars as characters. And like from my like personal experience, I can testify that people do show up to those events now in like in a war-torn country. There is some interest in this particular thing. So I was just wondering, how in your experience do you find it like possible to navigate such a complexity of like a topic that really requires us to be very cautious when we really like perhaps are not building like parallels, right, in like what's happening, let's say, with Russian forces that treat other nations as disposable in the way they recruit soldiers, and let's say for how Ukrainians perceived Burats in the initial state of invasion, which is a like complicated, layered story. And as you also like you mentioned it in your column, but somewhat in passing, that there was the opposite effort from Ukrainian many circles, not only like activist circles, to build the solidarity network of thinking that actually the Burat people were colonized by Russia, the same way as Chechen people were. Maybe Chechen is a more prominent example because Chechen people are also warriors. There is a big percent of like warriors on the Ukrainian side who are Chechen. I think they're the next ethnic group after Russians, Belarusians, and Georgians. So those like solidarity links are being built, and the last thing that I say, that there is that dynamic shifting that is happening, And I was just wondering how was navigating that complex dimension for you as a researcher working with this contemporary topic right now, and just as someone deeply interested in that, I very much appreciate that you take such an important and hard task to do, and finally bring something new to this discourse of decolonial studies that was forming for a very long time, and it is sometimes somewhat upsetting to just see it being attributed to people who were connected to most like Russian cultural production field and scholarly academia, be that Eskind or Sergei Ushak, even Madina Tlastanova, when we had people like Vitaly Chernetsky writing about this since 2003. Yeah, I'm so sorry for this long
Thank you,
comment.
Julia.
Thank you.
I think we should take a couple of questions because I see hands. So James, right?
Yeah, okay.
And then Jane, did you raise hand? Sorry, I didn't see. Yeah, okay.
So thank you again for the talk. I think in thinking about the sort of Soviet genealogy of post-Soviet primordialism, I wonder if you think that arts, music, and sort of cultural institutions played, any kind of role in it. And I'm thinking here specifically of things like Soviet Writers Association. And if you do see, like, just in the research you've done, these sorts of institutions playing a role, what direction do you see the sort of intellectual flow happening? Was stuff coming from the arts and culture into science, or the other way around?
Yeah, well, I want to question a little bit your mechanism that you described, the 3 steps of post-Soviet, the Soviet construction of primordialism, then the Snyder discussion, which I think is much reduced and not fair to Snyder, since he is a deep critic of American politics too. But skipping to that, what I'm really concerned about is what you call the explosion. To me, in some ways, this discussion replicates some of the problems of colonial studies in the 1990s, where historians and others were making attempts to get out of Eurocentrism. And then in the first phases of looking at colonialism, you ended up with colonizers and colonized, and in a way, victims of the Europeans who were the agents, the active agents. And in a way, this got us back into a kind of very Eurocentric kind of description of colonial and imperial power. Your description seems to have some of the same dangers, it seems to me, in the sense that it assigns so much agency to Western critiques like Snyder's. And my question to you as an activist would be, and you do describe yourself as an instrumentalist, why do people fall for it? Your description of stage 3 really gets us right back to saying that the West causes it all. And I can't believe that among the activists that you work with in many fields of post-Soviet regions, that in fact these positions are so dominant.
Thank you. So we have big 3 questions. Would you like to take them?
Sure. Thank you so much. Okay, to start with the Julia's question, thank you. How do I navigate these complex dynamics of combining these talking about different nationalism at this very terrible times when everything is on the front page of news? This is a very I think this is a very like big framing question. I think that, how do I navigate? It's very difficult. I'm gonna start here. It's very difficult because, like Yulia herself mentioned, it's happening right now. There are people talking about. I feel like I'm not answering the question.
Okay, do you want to start with and then return
Yeah,
back.
okay, so yeah, I don't know how I navigate. I guess I just plunge into the conversation and see what happens. I literally that's what happens. And then in the process, I read more, I have more conversations, I have changed my positions by a lot over the last 2 years, and yeah, that happened because I feel like we as specialist scholars, we need to always be open to new ideas and new challenges. Okay, and other question, second question, Soviet genealogy, whether arts, music, and literature played any role in constructing making primordialism happen, right? So I believe that the connection is very interesting to trace. I cannot answer specifically. I mean, we can come with an example of, I always come up with this example, the anecdote про Chukchu, the Chukchi jokes that were very much present in Soviet and post-Soviet. Basically, it's a series of short jokes about this persona of Chukcha, who appears in many different jokes, like ethnicized jokes. And this person's always like the butt of the joke, meaning that this person is usually viewed as very, very simple, very primitive, sexually too much, too sexual probably, too uneducated. Usually in those jokes, this person also doesn't speak Russian very well. And in that sense, I myself wrote an article for somewhere, I can't remember, about this problem because I think I was able to trace where the persona of this indigenous person, the Chukchi person, come from in these jokes. So in that sense, I mean, there were musical personas, artists that were oftentimes in Soviet culture and to this day portrayed as these like very essentialized representation, symbols of a specific ethnicity or even a region. Kolabildi comes to mind, if you know what I mean. Kolabildi was a musician. So I don't know whether, I think that it was, I don't think that the science dictated to arts and music what to do and how to play, how to distinguish people, how to represent people in arts, but I feel like there definitely was a relationship. It's probably reciprocal. I don't know. There've been conversations about Soviet cartoons and how they portrayed African people in Soviet cartoons, because there are cartoons that portray African people in very common for that time racist European Western way, and there are also Soviet cartoons that portray African people in a decolonial and decolonial contexts as humans, as agents of history, as subjects. So in that sense, it seems like to me, based on this very brief analysis of art and music, Soviet art and music, I feel like the general public, or the people at least who created art and music, they were somewhat aware of when they should treat people as humans and when they don't. In that sense, yeah, I think. Okay, and the next question. So the question about explosion, colonizers versus colonized, how I replicate the 90s conversation and come back to Eurocentrism and assign too much agency to Snyder and ignore why people fall for it. I feel like it's a very difficult topic to approach because the question of agency, first of all, is very contested, I would say, because I myself don't agree with measuring people or talking about systems from the position of who has agency and who doesn't, because we all live in a world that was shaped by and is shaped right now by very specific financial institutions and by very specific ways that we produce and engage and that we consume things. And in that sense, we are all given roles within this production of knowledge and material goods. And these roles ultimately determine the ways that we exist and the ways that we judge the society. Those roles also, I mean, Marxists call them classes. And agency, the category of agency, I believe, is kind of brushes over the specific roles that the society, the material condition assigned to us. So in that sense, Timothy Snyder, I assign a lot of agency to him because he's a very important political thinker, because he's not just a Yale professor or where he's now, but he's also a very important and very popular figure on social media that continues to be present everywhere. People, you log into like Kyiv Independent and he's everywhere. People know him. People know about him. And as his role as a public intellectual, as somebody from the West, as somebody who's a top tenured professor, is very much important. And it's definitely more important than any of the people that I engaged in conversation with and talked about today. In that sense, I assign a lot of agency to him because he is the person who shapes the ideas that I criticize, that shapes the way that we think about the world. And that is the role that it's not just something that he wants to do, it's also the role that he plays in our society and the role that he's being paid to play in our society. Why people fall for primordialism? Again, this is a question about agency. Again, I do not blame people for falling for primordialism. I do not blame people or individuals or groups for doing that. I believe that I'm not just strictly instrumentalist. I combine constructivism and instrumentalism. But as an instrumentalism, again, I believe that, yes, if we read even, what's his name, Benedict Anderson, we see that nations were constructed for a specific purpose, or we can interpret Anderson in this way, imagined communities, right? The communities were imagined within the specific process of creating industrial societies for the purpose of uniting specific communities around a specific goal of creating profit from this specific industry. And I believe that to this day, people continue to people use and people engage within these conversations. People believe that in their group identities, and they're being taught to believe in these group identities for a reason by specific systems. Like there are schools that teach people, there are intellectuals like Snyder that teach people. People consume media, people consume things that are constructed for them to consume, and as a result, they believe these theories. Should we blame them for falling for them? I don't think so. I myself grew up in Russia. I was taught primordialist theories. I was taught all of these Europeoid theories, and I am very much a product of this. And I did believe absolutely that my ancestors were blonde and blue-eyed. I believe them. I didn't take it out of the. It's something that you grow up with. Do I blame myself for falling for it? No. But also I don't think that I'm I don't know, super. I don't believe that I'm very just so smart that I was able to get out of this theoretical frame primordialism, because I have privileges to move to America to learn about other things that most people who still fall for ethno-nationalism and essentialism don't have. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. We have one question online and other questions here. Fred and
Greg.
Brad. Okay, so first is Stanislav, please.
You should be able
Stanislav?
to unmute now.
Stanislav Xenofontov. All right, while we are waiting.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. I'm here.
Hi,
If we can
Stas.
keep questions very brief.
Yeah, sure. It's very
Hi,
short.
Stas.
Thank you, Anna, for your presentation. So my question is, so you talked about the types of ethnicities, right? And I was wondering if we could combine three of them because we have so many examples when ethnic Russians in Sakha who are biologically not Sakha, but born in Sakha, speak perfect Sakha, and have gained, probably it's not the correct word, a Sakha identity through the social connection. And at the same time, we have settlers who came to Siberia and Sakha particularly as part of resource colonialism who can be part of artificial ethnicity you mentioned. I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bernie.
Thank you.
I'm very sympathetic to critiques of binaries and essentialism, but I wonder how you deal with what seems to me a glaring essentialism that's at the heart of decolonial theory, mainly the dichotomy of indigeneity that is abstracted from any particular community versus a Europe that's abstracted from any kind of history that Europe might have. And while this theoretical, what became the school, originated among scholars of Latin America, Latin American historians almost all reject it on the grounds that it effaces 200 years of history and basically says that you can explain everything through the reactions to coloniality. And there goes 200 years of Latin American history in which are a great many people mobilized and engaged with critically with different on different sides of questions like popular sovereignty versus the domination of elites, slavery versus anti-slavery, and all of that is effaced in the basic school, the Walter Mignolo school of decolonial thought. So it makes me wonder why the critique of essentialism stops with a critique of liberalism and doesn't embrace what seems to me an extreme essentialism that's at the heart of decolonial theory.
I think that was in the description of the talk, but maybe you didn't have time to reach there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was in the description. Yeah. I'm sure you can talk about this. And yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Anna. I really enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask maybe a slightly less theoretical question about the sort of transmission belt. How do you get from Snyder publishing a book of which there are many critiques, some of which I'm sympathetic to, some of which I think is maybe a little bit much, to a sort of racial essentialism popping up in the Russian cultural space? It seems to me there's a lot of information is lost. That's not a very high fidelity transmission somehow. Either some ideas are being distorted either intentionally or not, or people are reading, people aren't reading academic texts and getting everything the author intended out of them. Obviously, this happens when I read academic texts all the time. I'm just curious to hear more about how this transmission belt works, basically.
Yeah, in defense of Anna, we have 40 minutes.
Thank you. To start this question, so non-Sakha people who speak Sakha, I mean, I believe that yeah, the conversations over identity and language are very important, and I myself, as somebody who spoke Sakha as a child, but then forgot about it as a child. Yeah, this is very important to discuss because, again, as a part of a conversation about identity essentialism, there are a lot of popular views that if you don't speak a language, then you can't identify as somebody. Like, if you don't speak Buryat language, then you can't be Buryat. If you don't speak Sakha language, you can't be Sakha. You grow up around people who talk about that like that, and you hear that quite a lot from specifically nationalists. And yeah, that's something, again, that should be addressed, and that's something that I totally criticize as well. Another question, essentialism within decolonial theory. Yeah, I am not a fan of Mignolo, and I don't, I absolutely do not, like, I would say that I participated in the decolonial movements, but I don't necessarily myself now identify myself as, right now, I also continue to be decolonial. The decolonial thinker. Yeah, absolutely, Mignolo should be addressed, and this critique of essentialism that I believe that the critique of essentialism that I put through today, I believe that it does address any essentialism, and I don't know quite how. I know that you also asked about how my ideas also promote Eurocentrism, but I don't quite see how it happens. And I know that there are conversations about how specifically Marxist theory is Eurocentric, how class reductionism is Eurocentric. I am aware of that. And I don't know if I'm going to answer your question right now, but I believe that as if we talk about decoloniality, we're talking about the specific history that happened, began happening after the Industrial Revolution and the dawn of capitalism. So anything that comes before that obviously is, I feel like it's a different type of history, and there are certain, like you cannot talk about decolonizing history before capitalism. That's kind of not, just doesn't make much sense to me. I believe that when we talk about decolonial thought, originally, it should be talking about the specific timeline of history that begins with industrial capitalism. And yeah, that's the thing. If it's Eurocentric, yeah, I definitely can see how that could be seen as Eurocentric. But again, either is it Eurocentric, or are we just paying attention to the influence of European thought and European power structures and European economy on the entire world, which is, I mean, I don't want to use the word objective, but we all live in the post-colonial condition, meaning that we are all shaped by something that Europeans did. And that's our history, and that's something, yeah, it's like a Eurocentric condition as it is. To answer the question, Greg's question, that the jump from Snyder to racial essentialism, Yeah, this is something that I definitely struggled with trying to put into words, and you and I talked about it before. How this jump happens from Snyder making up the binaries and his anti-totalitarian criticism, how this becomes in my head or in our society, allegedly, according to me, how that becomes racial essentialism and nationalism. It's very I tried to make some empirical examples, but again, I'm working on it. I'm working on creating more examples, but when basically, probably it's like correlation versus causation, like somebody could say. But when you log on to any social media or massive talks, when you come to massive public talks about decoloniality or Ukraine or not Ukraine, Eastern Europe, you often can see the people who push the idea that Russians are somehow inherently different from Ukrainians are usually the same people who will probably, who also believe that you can racialize that dynamic too. Or you can oftentimes, in the discussion of Russians versus Ukrainians, this topic comes about a lot when Ukraine as the democratic West and when Russia as the Asiatic East. I made examples in the blog post I'm referencing. Almost quite recently, I feel like I listened to somebody on Dorscht trying to, somebody was trying to say that Russia is turning to Asia. There is a Dmitry Bykov's interesting poem where he again makes this distinction that that Russia decided to detach itself from the West by associating itself with Africa. And Dmitry Bykov in this poem, it's called Сколько раз не папуас. And Dmitry Bykov in this poem makes a very specific racialized example of that. How allegedly by turning away from the West, Russia becomes not just despotic and Asiatic, but also becomes literally in Bykov's imagination becomes Diki becomes like, you know, wild tribes of Africa or something, the ways. So I don't know, this is the example that I came with. Of course, this is not Timothy Snyder, but again, like I say, I noticed and people notice, everybody notices that if the people who make the binary between Europe, democratic Europe and Asiatic Russia are usually the same people who later racialize it. So somebody takes it and racializes. I will come up with more examples in the future.
But maybe just to go, maybe you can add Walter Mignola to Timothy Snyder because
Oh yes.
He's so popular in Russia among Russian academics.
Mhm.
He just I don't know much about it, but I always meet in Russian text. Mignola said this, Mignola that. So they use his definition of decoloniality, and also now decolonial thinkers use him to promote. And that's the problem as well.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it's also the problem is for me with Mignolo is that when he says how we should define decoloniality, he explicitly mentions in his works that we should only think about decoloniality as ideas. For Mignolo, ideas come before the material conditions we live in, and that framework, of course, it opens way to
another essentialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. question?
I do
Okay,
have a
last question, yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for your presentation. I am wondering if you could speak about, what are the objects of your analysis in the contemporary moment? So the first part of your talk, you were giving this sort of survey of decolonial discourse in scholarship, published scholarship on the former Soviet space, and then, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're then making the move to show that contemporary, perhaps public discourse, not so much published scholarship, but maybe public discourse, including social media and public talks that we might log on to with Zoom accounts, I'm just trying to understand what is the scope of the contemporary decolonial discourse that you're suggesting is missing the opportunity to engage in a critique of class or neoliberalism because it's been distracted by arguments like Snyder's in particular. Are the objects of your analysis, is it mainly this kind of internet-based discussion zone, sort of, engaged public intellectuals and social media users, or is there, and is it mostly focused around people who are engaging in issues of Ukraine, or because, how does this reception of Snyder play out in Kazakhstan, for example? You mentioned that are you looking at journalism there, or just what are the objects of your analysis? What is the scope of this phenomenon of contemporary decolonial discourse that is really being persuaded by Snyder specifically and distracted and pulled into this primordialism?
Yes, thank you. I don't have, I'm trying, there is, of course, a way to separate the discourse on decoloniality in Eastern Europe, and then by country by country, and then Central Asia, and then country by country, and then Siberia, country by country. But sort of when you exist within this public discourse, of course, it's mostly on social media, but then also there are public conversations that happen on Zoom when multiple people from multiple different regions and different job professions come together. Ultimately, the object becomes the subject, all of us. We become the objects of ourselves. And I am also my own object of discussion, because, again, this whole thing that I presented is not just something that I observed, but it also something that I participated in. So we can certainly, what is the scope? I feel like my scope is, I know it's controversial to even use for many people, to even use the term post-Soviet space, but I believe that my scope or my object of analysis is still the post-Soviet space, not because I want these people or us to be, I don't know, or something, not because of that, but because, as Magirner and Schnirelmann's research shows, or Schnirelmann specifically research shows, we have still a common knowledge, common historical myths, and common methodological dimensions that we all use after the Soviet Union, because we still had the same centralized mass education for how many years? 74 years. We had common media that we all consume. We had it's a common space. So when you discuss the primordialism, it is not Russian primordialism, it is not Ukrainian primordialism, it's not Kazakhstan primordialism, Kazakh primordialism. It is post-Soviet primordialism, because it was created by institutions that were, ultimately coexisted, and as we know, were subject to censorship, were subject to specific methodology, and they created this idea that when you log on to any kind of Zoom conversations and start talking about, I don't know, Kalmyk people or Buryat people, somebody would come up with a, oh, hey, are we gonna let's measure, I don't know, how Kalmyk somebody is. Let's like do blood tests to determine whether we should decolonize somebody. Those kind of things always come up, and yeah, so we're kind of like the objects, the subjects of our own subjects and the objects, basically.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.